My Lords, the Most Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, made a very powerful speech, on which I congratulate him. He reminded us of our duty to receive, indeed welcome, refugees. That, as many noble lords have remarked, cannot be challenged. The challenge, my lords, is to distinguish between those who are genuine refugees and those who are economic migrants. And it's not an easy thing to do. My lords, the present situation in the Channel is extremely damaging to the reputation of the government, to the rule of law, to community relations, and perhaps even to confidence in our political system as a whole. That said, a major incentive for these arrivals is that they are now very unlikely to be sent home. Most of those whose claims fail will join the illegal population of the UK, which runs into at least 1 million, or more even, and it might well include, of course, some of their relatives. As a matter of fact, 15% of cross-channel arrivals in 2019 had already made a claim elsewhere. 70% are aged men aged between 18 and 39, and 98% have no passport. Why? Because they've destroyed it, to make it more difficult to decide their case. And of course, 100% are coming from a safe country. My lords, this cannot be allowed to continue. It really cannot. And we must find a way forward within the framework of ethics that the noble Archbishop mentioned. My lords, suggestions from the asylum lobby, if I may call them that we should establish safe and legal routes, may be useful as soundbites, but they're simply unrealistic. Applications would have to be made in some third country at an application centre presumably run by the British government. Surely it's absolutely clear that such a facility would be immediately overwhelmed by applications. And any host government would see this immediately. And they would see that they would be left holding the baby, responsible for all the people we had rejected, and they're just not going to go down that route, and of course none of them have. Meanwhile, our government, of course, are in real difficulty. Nearly 60% of the public think that they have lost control of our borders, and there's something in that. 84% think that they are handling immigration badly. Yet much of the national conversation, including, if I may say so, this debate, simply does not reflect the reality of public opinion on this issue. And here I commend the courageous speech by Baroness Stowell at the outset of this debate, and later the remarks of the noble Lord Horan. My lords, the fundamental issue is that the authority of our government is being blatantly undermined. The government is tied up in knots by the current framework of law, so it's time perhaps that that whole framework was re-examined. The 1951 Refugee Convention, so often referred to and widely applauded, but it's seldom realised that it applies only to events in Europe and only to those that preceded 1951. It wasn't until 1966 that the UN protocol widened its application to the whole world without time limit or geographical restriction, and with very, very little public discussion at the time. And in the ensuing half century, conditions have changed enormously throughout the world, and so too has the legal framework. It's possible now for cases to include the fate of women in some countries, of gay people in others, of persecution by factions who are not the government, and by degrading treatment in some circumstances. So it's important to note at this point that both the Refugee Convention and the UN Protocol provide for signatories to withdraw at 12 months' notice. We need, therefore, I suggest, my lords, to give serious consideration as to whether this legal framework is still appropriate. There may be cries of horror at any such suggestion, but we must recognise that a continuation of the present chaos will be very harmful to those who themselves need asylum. We should therefore consider establishing a mechanism, perhaps a royal commission or something of that kind, to examine all options. And my noble friend Lord Brownbeaten Haywood touched on that possibility, and so did Baroness Fox. The overall aim would be to ensure that the system continues to be supported by the wider public and is not overwhelmed by the huge number of claims, some of which are unlikely to be successful. To conclude, my lords, I'd like to say a word of welcome to the very wide-ranging report on asylum published this week by the Centre for Policy Studies. In her foreword to that report, the Home Secretary wrote, "The British public are fair-minded, tolerant and generous in spirit, but they're fed up with the continuing flouting of our laws and immigration rules so as to game the asylum system." My lords, exactly so.